Well, the fuel prices we are seeing at the petrol browser are among the most visible economic consequences of the war in the Middle East. But beyond oil, there is another critical resource that comes from the region that is likely to hurt our hip pockets. And that is fertilizer, in particular urea, the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer in the world. And much of it comes from the Middle East. Andrew Whitelaw is a commodity market analyst and co-founder of Episode 3. He says the flow-on effects on agriculture and ultimately food prices will be significant.
Look, it's a significant export hub for fertilizer because basically most urea is produced somewhere where there's lots of access to cheap energy, and the Middle East is traditionally one of those areas. In terms of overall volumes, I don't have that to the top of my head just now, but if we're looking at it from an Australian point of view, about 2/3 of our urea comes from the Middle East and 1/3 comes from Asia. So a significant volume. And if we're talking about just directly that sort of Strait of Hormuz area, you're talking about 20 to 30% of the world's urea supplies coming through just that strait alone.
That is a huge amount, Andrew. How critical, an input is this for agriculture?
It is almost impossible to sort of really say how important it is to agriculture. If we didn't have urea, which is a synthetic nitrogen, we wouldn't be able to sustain a population of, above 6 billion. Possibly not even 5 billion. That is how important it is. And basically, it is like the ingredient for growing plants. So it's a bit like coffee. Yes, you can grow a plant without that ingredient, but your day will just not be quite as productive as if you had that coffee. So it basically turns a good crop into a really good crop. So if we don't have urea, you can expect crop yields to drop by potentially 30-40%, which is significant.
Yeah, that's a big shortfall. And so, in terms of the produce, what sort of shortfall are we looking at? And what might be the impacts both here and across the wider Asia-Pacific region?
I think it's really important to just comment that it's definitely a crisis for farmers because they do need this urea in the next couple of months. But it probably won't be necessarily immediately felt by consumers at the supermarket. It will definitely flow through to things like bread, but then also to other commodities like things like chicken and pork and any type of meat that is fed grains. Because effectively, if we reduce that access to grains, the price of meat goes up because supply and demand fundamentals effectively flow through. If grain supplies drop because of yields, price goes up, and then that flows through to almost every food product that we have on the shelf.
Is there elsewhere that Australia and other countries can look at to fill the shortfall that's arising from the Middle East?
Absolutely. And like I said before, we get about 30% of our urea typically from mainly Southeast Asian countries. And we still have access to that. But we've got to bear in mind that the Middle East is practically, for all intents and purposes, it is shut down when it comes to urea access. So everybody else is chasing the same limited volumes of fertilizer. And other countries that produce it, for instance, Russia produces a lot of urea. That's obviously a touchy country to trade with and is subject to sanctions and financial restrictions. But everyone is chasing the same volume from Southeast Asia or from the US. So yes, there are other places to buy it, but it's going to be considerably more expensive. Prices have already jumped up 64% since the start of the year.
And Andrew, from history, has this happened before in the more recent past, and what have been the consequences of it?
Yeah, definitely. Fertilizer price shocks and supply shocks are relatively rare. The first real one was the Suez Crisis in the 70s. I don't personally remember that one. But we also had the commodities boom in the early 2000s. And then we also had the Ukraine war in 2021, 2022 that rose urea prices because of gas prices rising. But I think 2008 is a really good example of just how much the impact has, just not just on farmers, not just on consumers in the developed world or the Australia and the likes. We also have that impact on the poorer people around the world, because in Australia and in other countries like the US, Europe, it will cause us a cost of living crisis. But the difference is, if you're in a country like in Africa, even parts of the Middle East, there is a chance that it will make a decision. The difference between whether you actually feed yourself or not, because we spend about 15% of our average income on food, whereas in some of those countries they will be spending 50% plus on food. And we saw this as the result from 2008 with high fertilizer prices. It caused lower yields. There were lower yields around the world at that point as well because of drought as well, which exacerbated problems. But the flow-on effect was that there was a massive increase in the number of food riots, especially through the Middle East, which can be linked to the Arab Spring. So it's a huge issue, and it's not one that necessarily, like I said before, it's not instantaneous. It will seep through to society as yields drop and as access to fertilizer drops throughout the world.
Yes, and so in that vein, when might we in Australia, for instance, start seeing prices go up?
Look, I think what we may see is towards the latter half of this year at the supermarket shelf, we may start to see prices increase because we're going to have farmers who are about to plant their crop, usually about Anzac Day. If they have access to the fertilizer, they will hopefully be able to produce a bountiful crop, and hopefully the rain comes to provide that. However, if they don't have access to that fertilizer, if this conflict doesn't end soon, then there will be massive concerns where it comes to availability of access to supply within Australia, which mean the yields won't be as good as they could have been. A lot of the potential will get lost from farmers' production. So that is a big risk. And then it's when they go to sell, and when consumers such as your bakery companies, your flour mills, when they don't have ready access to wheat, for instance, then the bread price goes up.
Yes, yet another flow-on effect from this conflict in that region. Andrew Whitelaw, really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks for having me.